it means that some potentially really exciting ideas about how we could organize ourselves as a society are not getting a chance to be tried out. 51% of people decide that they're going to confiscate the property of the 49%. They can legally do that. They've got interests in making things appear as prosperous as possible within that 5-year period and thinking less about the future.
But that's just the facade for the normal person to see that they're in a free country. Welcome back to the Renegade Lifestyle Podcast, seeking to empower you with practical strategies and information to exit the matrix and become ungovernable. Today we are joined by Peter Young of the Free Cities Project. We'll be going into a deep dive on what it is. Obviously, this is also the month where we're going through the 15-minute city as a whole, and we're looking at now the solution or potential solution with an extraordinary guest here today who's a visionary behind the Free Cities Project, which is a groundbreaking initiative that aims to create autonomous and thriving city-states around the world. So I guess please welcome Peter Young. He is the founder, and thank you for being here today.
Thanks for having me on the podcast, George. I'm not quite the founder, but I'm
okay.
the managing director of the Free Cities Foundation. Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, sorry for that. Not sure where I saw that. But yeah, thank you very much for joining. It's an interesting one because the 15-minute cities kind of project or plan, which we won't really discuss here today because we've discussed that in a few different videos, or we will be discussing in a few more different videos on the show. We won't be discussing it, but this is a relevancy to this project because you're kind of the antithesis of it. And it will be interesting to get your sort of ideas on what's happening and also how we can sort of improve how cities function. So let's start by discussing the origins of the Free Cities Project. So what inspired you to sort of embark on the journey, your story yourself as well, and I guess what is the Free Cities Project? So your past and what is the Free Cities Project?
Sure. So the Free Cities Foundation was set up in order to try and create more innovation in governance. When you look around the world today, we see that the various countries of the world, although they have different kinds of messaging and marketing around what they do, they tend to operate in quite a similar way. So the way that governments raise revenues is typically through a series of taxes like income tax, VAT, sales tax, land tax. The way that they manage their economy is typically through some kind of government-controlled money with a central bank. And what we think is that some of these central pillars of how societies are governed are ripe for innovation. And one of the problems we have in the world is that there isn't enough competition between governments. We have a lot of organizations that are moving away from this idea that governments should be competing. There are more international organizations like the European Union, which is seeking to harmonize governmental systems, harmonize taxation across nation states. And we think that this isn't a great trend because it means that some potentially really exciting ideas about how we could organize ourselves as a society are not getting a chance to be tried out. So what the Free Cities Foundation does is it encourages people that want to take power to the local level so that they can try out different kinds of governance model. And the definition of a free city that we have is any kind of territory that is seeking to become self-governing so that it can adopt a system that upholds individual rights and freedoms. There are about 14 projects in our directory, and these range from projects that are just starting out, that have some kind of freedom-focused or libertarian ethos to them, that are forming a community of people and eventually seek to have some level of self-governing ability, to projects that have already achieved that. So projects like Ciudad Morazan and Prospera, two autonomous zones that have got a completely separate legal system in Honduras. So the free cities are examples of these like self-governing territories that are seeking to introduce new systems so that the people of the world have more options of places where they can go to live and work.
So it sounds like we're sort of having local governance trials within a sort of larger nation. So it's not kind of like a mass city adoption. It's more of a sort of testing on the local level and grow that sort of grassroots style.
Yeah. So one of the key things to make clear is that free cities are not a concept for existing cities. They are they're areas of land that are currently uninhabited and are seeking to create a new system with a unique governance structure and then invite people in to be part of that future. So one of the challenges we have at the moment with governance is that if you want to make a change, typically you're working within a majoritarian one person, one vote system where there's a general election every few years and the people have to make a choice between normally one of two very similar political parties. And the problem with this system is that people individually can't be specialists in governance. We don't expect everyone to be specialists in medical care or specialists in finance or specialists in civil engineering. And so in those sectors, we leave the decisions up to people that are specialized in that area. And those people make the decisions and they offer things on the market that people can voluntarily choose to opt into. But in the area of governance, we have a different decision-making process whereby we ask the entire population to make a decision, and that decision is not weighted by any kind of economic sacrifice. So someone who is highly invested in the future of a particular country and has lots of family and capital there has a vote that is worth the same as someone who is about to leave or has just arrived or isn't particularly invested in the future of that country. So within a free city, rather than saying that we make decisions by casting votes in this majoritarian way, the way that we make the decision is that there is an organization that sets the rules for a certain territory, and then they invite people to come in. They make clear what the terms are for living together, and then they invite other people to be part of that future. And so that's a key way that we would make decisions in a way that is kind of different from, say, like having a local council elect a new councillor in an existing city. We invite people in to join a new future so that everyone that is part of the community has consented to the rules.
So you kind of have a preset rule base. I guess it's like a preset rules that people accept as they sort of enter the community, right? So I guess it kind of is similar to a country, but the difference is that you allow each individual to have an equal say, or how does that work in terms of the governance within the actual society itself as it grows? Because I know at a small scale, community is easy to manage, right? Because people can make, if you have a group of 8 people in a community, you can kind of kick out any bad actors or any sort of people who want to maybe put the sort of community at a detriment. But when it's like a nation state, you have as you've seen, you've got a sort of the evil goes to the power, and you can kind of like at this point have controllers in there where you can barely touch now. So kind of how do you guys see that being managed? Okay, it's kind of a different scale because it's not as large, but as it does get bigger, there could be egocentric interests in some people's eyes, right? So how do you feel that can be managed? Because that is always a difficulty in community and building community.
Yeah, so one of the key aspects of what's called the free private city model, which is one of the governance models that we work with, is that there is a private owner of the land. And what that owner does is they invite tenants to come in, or citizens to be part of the community. And within their contract, they state what the terms are. So, for example, on this land, you're allowed to build up to a certain height. You're not allowed to make noise after 10 p.m. or before 7 a.m. You must respect the life, liberty, and property of other people living in the community. The landowner decides what the rules are, and then they also decide what they're going to charge for maintaining the security of the area, because a piece of land is only able to be maintained if it's kept secure from outside hostility. So they have a fee that's associated with being part of the community, and that is specified in the contract, so that the person that comes in knows exactly what the terms of living together are and how much they're going to have to pay for that service. And the reason why that's very different from what we have now is that if more people come into that community and it becomes 51% of people decide that they want to change the rules for the person that was there first, they're not able to do that by a simple majority vote. If someone's come in and invested in an area early on based on the understanding that they're going to have to pay a certain amount of money and that there are certain rules, the people that have arrived later can't come in and change the rules. And equally, the person that's been there first can't change the rules for other people that arrive later. It's down to the operator to decide what the individual contracts are going to be for people. And as long as they're all compatible, as long as everyone's rights are protected within that system, people can't influence the contracts of others. And so that's very different from our current system, whereby if, for example, 51% of people decide that they're going to confiscate the property of the 49%, they can legally do that within a majoritarian system by just voting for a party that advocates that particular course of action. So we think that this sort of system is more protecting of human rights and is going to allow people to live a better and more prosperous future in the long term.
Is there a potential danger of because there is a centralization in terms of power, is there a potential for malice action in changing rules by this centralized entity in the future, and then impacting the society that's maybe established there now over years? Maybe it isn't a problem at the beginning because the rules are new, you've accepted them and you're happy with them. But at a future stage when you're more settled in the area, and I don't know, for some reason there's some exploitation opportunity for the centralized entity to, as we see, I guess, in regular society now, as this tiptoe into a tyrannical sort of state. Is there a potential for that? Because I think that would be maybe one of my concerns if I sort of look at it off the bat there.
Yeah, I think whenever anyone's in control of resources, there's the potential for them to act in a malicious way. And the question that we all have is, how do we create systems that minimize the potential for that malicious action rather than maximize it? If you look at the system we have in most modern nation states, you have political leaders that have no long-term direct interest in the resources that are at their command. So Prime Minister gets into power, they have the funds of the Treasury at their disposal, they have all of the state buildings, the infrastructure, they have control over the fire department, the police, the healthcare system, all of the physical assets that they have at any given time. But they don't have an interest in what those assets are going to be worth in 50 years' time. They are only in power for, say, 5 years. And so they've got interests in making things appear as prosperous as possible within that 5-year period and thinking less about the future. An analogy I like to make is like, imagine you had if you were given an apartment and you were only in charge of this apartment for a single year, including you had the credit cards of the owner of the apartment, and you could make changes to the walls and to the to the furniture. Well, if you had all those resources, you probably throw a party every week and put all the money on the credit card and make all kinds of changes. You wouldn't worry about dealing with any dry rot or any issues like minor leaks that may cause a problem 5 years down the line but aren't an issue now. And probably everyone in the neighborhood would think you were a great neighbor because you've shown them a great party and you've been able to be very hospitable. But of course, what they don't see is that in 5 years' time, the apartment then becomes very run down. There's no money left, so you can't throw any parties anymore. And you're then in a much worse state than you were previously. And I think there's a bit of an analogy here between modern governments. And so the reason I bring that up in relation to your question is that within our system, you have a entity that is owning the land. So they have a long-term interest in what the future is going to be. So if they turn around and they suddenly say, we're reneging on all of our contracts, we're not going to respect the rights of the citizens that we signed up to, then the citizens will leave. Everyone will immediately know what's happened, which will mean that the city operator won't be able to get as many future residents in. And there are, just in general, to come back to my point about, these are cities that seek to maximize individual rights and freedoms rather than state rights and freedoms. In general, there are fewer functions of the state. So the state is not providing healthcare or education or pensions. So there are fewer resources there in general that the state actor can command and abuse and steal from other people. So for those reasons, although you can never rule out the chance of there being corrupt behavior and people using their resource in a bad way, I think this system minimizes it much more than what we have in our current modern states.
Very interesting. Yeah. I wanted to move it on to kind of like how taxation would work, or if there is, or if it's optional, like in Liberland. If you've probably heard of Liberland, who are starting to have settlers there, and they currently have a kind of optional tax system there. I wanted to sort of understand how you guys saw how it would function regarding taxation, if that's an optional or if it's a mandatory thing. Currency, is there a potential adoption of a currency in the small community which is different to the current monetary system? How would you see those two aspects?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because one of the key functions that people associate with the government is that the government should provide a currency. And within free cities, we don't think that has to be the case at all. We see money as just a medium of exchange for facilitating transactions. And the reason why governments maintain their own currencies is arguably because it allows them to gain economic seigniorage through creating more units of the currency each year than there were previously. So expanding the supply each year. Within free cities, generally speaking, we encourage systems where citizens have as much choice as possible. So there wouldn't be we wouldn't see the need for these cities to create their own currencies. We would advocate a system where people are allowed to use whatever currency they want, whether that's US dollars, Bitcoin, Monero, some other kind of national government currency, gold bullion. We think it should be a free choice for individual people, and whether those people that choose good forms of money that they can save in will do well in the long run, and those people that don't will do less well. But at the end of the day, none of us have a crystal ball and know what the outcomes are going to be. So basically, in terms of revenues, rather than having a specific unit of currency that the city creates and then demands in taxes, as you have in most modern nation states, you have a system where there is a fee that will be set in the contract. How exactly that fee is set will be down to the operator of the city. But one way it could work is that there is a fee, perhaps maybe just fixed in some unit. You might say the fee is zero point 0.1 Bitcoin per year, and no matter what Bitcoin does price wise, your fee is the same. Or you might say that it's 1 ounce of gold per year, or you might say that it's like this many US dollars adjusted by some kind of inflation index. So there are many options, but what I think you'd likely see is that there is a standard for what the fee is that's legally binding, and then there are multiple different ways you can pay. So you could pay the fee in US dollars, you could pay an equivalent in Bitcoin, you could pay an equivalent in gold. I think that kind of system, although we haven't seen that. I mean, we've kind of seen that actually. So in Prospera, you can pay your citizen fees using US dollars, a few cryptocurrencies. So I think that system will be more common because it makes most sense, and it will be most attractive to residents that are increasingly mobile and using global currencies rather than parochial national currencies.
It's interesting because even if there was malicious actions from, let's say, the central party here to raise that fee all the time, if we have a multiple connection of these free cities, someone will just go, the citizens will just pick up and go to those places which will treat them better. So it's an interesting thing where it will be a competition, this is full on anarcho-capitalism. So where you can really you choose where treats you right, and that's, I guess, what works. If we can set up a multiple amount of these cities, then we have a freedom of choice, which works wonders. What do those fees buy you? Because it's interesting, because I know a lot of people say taxation is theft, and I think in its current state it is, because we don't ever know where that goes. We actually probably know where it goes, and it's usually to the wrong people, and it goes into agendas and lobbying and all kinds of things. Will it be fully transparent? Because taxation actually, or a citizen fee is interesting because it is a service that you should be expecting from a place that charges you for something. So what actual service does that give you, or is that just dictated by the person who's kind of in control of the land, let's say? Or is there an example of that you currently have?
Yeah, so the thing that we advocate is the most voluntary kind of system possible. So one of the reasons that some people who are libertarians say that taxation is theft is because you don't have a choice. If you're born in an area, you have to pay whatever the taxes are, and you don't know what they're going to be. It's not a predictable system, and the system can change on you at any point. And there's no clear relationship between the service you get and what you pay. So this kind of way of raising money is entirely different from the most other services. Other services, you can say voluntarily opt out of them if you don't like the service, and you're able to make a decision, an informed decision, before you consent based on the amount of money that's paid. So that's what we create in the free cities. And to answer your question, what does it fund? Well, primarily what we want to encourage is for entrepreneurs to make that decision for themselves, because it may be that there's a demand for certain services to be provided centrally in some communities, and that's fine as long as people are agreeing to it. Maybe people want common education to be dealt with by the state in a particular community, and as long as people all agree to that, then we don't have an objection to it. But I think what we'd likely see as the most attractive option would be that the fee is kept relatively low, and it just goes to fund basic things that are to do with the security and management of the physical land, because after all, the owner is the person that's running the city is the land owner. So there are certain things that need to be done to maintain rights of way, to maintain safe passage around the area, to defend the area. So the fee would fund things like the defense of the area from outside attack. Um, it would fund like internal policing and security, most likely, although there are people that argue that that could be dealt with on a purely private basis as well. And I think both options are valid. There would also be some likely some infrastructure, because you have a problem with, like, if the owner's saying do what you want, build roads, and you can have the roads if you build them, if you buy the land, then there might be issues with like people being able to charge, like block people out of the city and charge rates that are unreasonably high to get in. Things like that might prove to be an issue if you didn't have the landowner dealing with that particular aspect of the development. And then the third aspect would be some kind of arbitration center. So in the case that there are disputes that take place on the land, for example, between two people that have both agreed to the rules of this territory and have a dispute relating to them, it may be that the city authority serves as an arbiter in those cases, and that obviously comes with some costs as well. Although that could largely be funded through, private fees, arguably. So those would be the main functions that would likely be provided in the most, market-driven form of free city. And as you can see, they're very different from what's provided in a modern welfare state.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I mean, we're looking here at a kind of very close to free market, pretty much free market city, really, where it's kind of let the free market decide. Okay, there is a centralized entity, but the free market will decide whether they want to stay there or not, or whether they want to move to another place or not participate at all. So it's kind of different in that sense. I think there is a case for, once you start funding police, you get the issue of further weaponized control, because you then have the police force on basically being paid by the centralized entity, and I think that's where you get issues, because then there's like a buffer between the actual land owner or the centralized people and the people themselves, because you've got these guys whose incentives, who've been paid by that centralized person to act on behalf of that person rather than the people. So yeah, I guess private police, I've advocated for that. Once you've got a competition, they won't be so expensive and you can use private security. I guess there are issues with that also, but there's definitely a lot of issues with the current way the police are funded, and police issues in traditional nation states. So what's your vision for the Free Cities project in terms of how do you see this looking going into the future? Are there any new plans coming up, and what's your sort of vision for them? And at the moment, you said they're in Honduras. You've got, is there 2 communities there?
Yeah, so the 2 most advanced communities that are adopting private governance models are in Honduras. They're called Prospera and Ciudad Morazan. There are a few other communities as well that we work with. There's one called Small Farm Cities in Malawi, which is an agricultural farming project, which is creating clear property rights for agricultural workers in an area where they're currently quite ill-defined. So it doesn't make a lot of sense for people to invest in the land in an appropriate way. So that's one example. There's also like freedom-focused intentional communities like Liberstad in Norway that are seeking to bring together people that abide by the non-aggression principle, and then in future seek some kind of political autonomy. So we've got the whole spectrum of projects that we're working with currently. But what I would expect to see in the future is more and more of these projects seek autonomy and grow, because I think there's just a really valuable, value proposition there. A lot of the things that people put up with in modern states, in terms of, for example, working out what taxes you have to pay to do business in the country. When you think about like working out, if you need to be an incorporated entity, if you're going to pay sales tax or tax on profits or income taxes, all these things, they're a result of historical processes that are really antiquated and allow for all kinds of loopholes that people regard as incredibly unfair. Like, we have all of this talk about large corporations not paying very much tax, and I think that's the general feeling is they should pay more. But I would say, like, the general problem here is that when you have a complicated system, which is what we have, then people that are large and can afford more specialized advice are going to be able to take advantage of that system better. So I think in our system, because like stuff like tax is so much simpler, because people are so much freer to do new and interesting things than they would normally be and create value for other people, I just think these centers are going to become more and more attractive, and they'll end up drawing in more people, more capital. There'll be more and more success stories. And I think, say 10 years into the future, we won't be talking about, 14 of these projects. We'll hopefully be talking about 100 of these projects, and maybe, 10, 15 that have got that real legal autonomy, which is the thing that I think you need if you're going to do this properly. So, the aim is basically in the long term to have fewer highly centralized states where power rests in the hands of a very few people who can do things like command the resources of hundreds of millions of people to go to war, and is instead devolved to the local level. And I think when you have that, there's more incentive for people to cooperate, and it makes less sense to take aggressive action against other people. Because if you're small, you feel the consequences of that much more directly. You have to pay the costs of that, and you see the costs of that much more directly than you do when you have these massive super states that we have in today's world.
Yeah, it really is like that. I mean, like I mentioned earlier, like it seems so difficult to have a massive amount of population and to have a community that actually functions properly or functions really, because when you have a small community, which actually, like you said, you can see the actions being taken out. You can see, let's say, if there's a mayor or something of those 10 or 50, even 100 people, that person can be accountable for his actions, because let's say he makes a decision, those other the population don't like, they can take action very easily, and he could either be chucked out, or that he could just be demoted back into the community, and then someone else jumps in. So it's so different when it's a smaller community rather than a huge city where you do not really ever have any influence at all. You're just basically a cog in the wheel, as they say. So more on a like emotional level, Peter. So what gave you this? What made you go down this route? Really, I think is the interesting one. Is like, what made you get into this subject and sort of be part of this project?
Yeah, I've always been interested in like political philosophy. I studied it a bit at school, and I then went on to work for the UK government in China. So I had some experience working within a major government and seeing how decisions are made from within. And in around 2017, I got introduced to the Austrian School of Economics, and I found that this gave me a much clearer understanding of how economies function than what I'd been learning previously and what was kind of the orthodoxy within government circles. So I did a deep dive into that, became fascinated by economics. And that period of about 3 years then caused me to start looking around and saying, well, if this standard way of governing societies is not as aligned to good economic thinking as it seems, who are the people out there that are doing things that are much more free market and much more voluntarist in nature? And that's when I came across the Free Cities Foundation and the work of Titus Gabel, who's the founder of the organization. And I thought that this would be a really meaningful thing to like devote my time and effort to, because I think in some libertarian circles there's a lot of theorizing and thinking about how an ideal society could function, but there probably aren't loads of organizations that are able to achieve like practical change by implementing those ideas. And I think the reason for that is that if you try and work with existing national governments, because of the decision making processes, because economics is complicated, it's not necessarily intuitive, and arguments about, you know, if you say to everyone, we're going to give everyone free healthcare, we're going to give everyone free education, it sounds great, and that's appealing to the vast majority of people. But it's more difficult to explain why that might not be the best idea in terms of the incentives it creates and the ability to provide a good quality service to people in a targeted way. Like, that's much more of a nuanced argument. And if you have a system where it just, it's like a kind of popularity contest for the leaders rather than like based on a deep understanding of the issues, then I think it's always going to be a struggle to implement more libertarian ideas by trying to convince people to vote for a particular party. So if that's not the route we're going down, what is the alternative? And I think the most viable alternative that we have is to say, look, if that's the system you want to have, then you can have it in this area. But people should be free to determine their own future. That's even, a right under various UN charters, that people should be free to pursue self-determination. And so all we're asking for is for a small area of land where we can try out something different. And if you don't want to be a part of that, that's fine. We still will be your friends and cooperate with you peacefully, but you should at least allow us to put our ideas into action in a different area. And if you're correct and we've got bad ideas and we're not going to create a good society, then we'll fail in a few years. But I think that pursuing that path is more realistic than trying to change, the rules for hundreds of millions of other people at once. It's best to start small and show that this model can be successful on that level, and allow it to grow. And the Free Cities Foundation is doing that, and that's why I wanted to be a part of that story.
That's excellent. I mean, it's basically like, instead of battling the existing, just build something better and make the old obsolete. That's the saying, isn't it? I don't know who came up with that one, but that's the sort of making the old obsolete, and that's what you're kind of trying to do here. I have 2 points. The one on free healthcare, which is interesting because most people actually feel like that is an amazing point of the UK, like in the NHS. And we're seeing now how it fails in the end. We're seeing, I wanted your sort of idea on this. We're seeing the NHS kind of fail now, finally. I think it's kind of been failed for a long time. The National Health Service, the health service here in the UK, where it's just become overrun. What's your sort of, feeling and I guess your idea on how healthcare, in a sort of more communist way or socialist way we have in the UK, has kind of failed gradually? And what would you actually suggest as being a better solution? Would you suggest all private? Because I actually feel, right, that private healthcare works if you have a numerous amount of people vying for business, having, and then the free market decides which one wins, the better service wins. And also the price goes down if you've got a lot of supply, if you've got more people doing that service. So not, for example, there wouldn't be, the cost of private healthcare right now is huge, but if you have a numerous amount, it won't be like that, because of supply and demand and economics, which people don't actually really understand. And that's where they just hear on the news, like, there's free healthcare, there's free this, but it's not. And, it's, like you said, it's kind of like a political vehicle there for them to use. But how would you, I guess, your alternative to healthcare as it is in the UK? Because in my opinion, it's a failed thing that they're doing here. What would you kind of do in that sense?
Well, in terms of the free cities, they would be free to make that decision. If you want a personal view from me, I'm I mean, yeah, I mean, I'm a libertarian, as pretty libertarian as you can get. So I don't advocate that the state is really providing um, very many services at all centrally. Certainly not healthcare. Um, one of the things, one of the problems that we have in the UK, I mean, there seems to be like a kind of national religion around the NHS in the UK. It's very hard to question anything about the NHS. The NHS ends up spending ever larger amounts of money every year, and the solution is always that the NHS needs more funding. Um, One of the problems that we have is that there aren't really fully free market healthcare systems anywhere in the world, and so there's not an example of a really good functioning private system that you can compare it to. Like the US, for example, is often cited as like what we don't want to have within in the realm of healthcare, and is characterized as a free market system. But the US system is kind of got some market elements which I think can be good in certain ways, in that they give people more choice, but they're coupled with some incredibly statist elements. The way that healthcare is regulated, for example, like drugs, in order to be used in the US, have to go through a lengthy approval process, which costs billions of US dollars. There's one specific standard, which is the government, which all the new drugs have to go through, regardless of whether that system is preventing people that could otherwise have their lives saved from accessing treatment. If they don't meet this particular government standard, which is incredibly costly, the medicine treatment can't be used. So the fact that it's that costly, the fact that it's that costly means that it's only going to be very large companies that can kind of start to take a monopolistic role in the economy, that can afford to bring new healthcare and treatments to market. That's an important factor. And then the other thing is we're creating artificial monopolies through intellectual property. And intellectual property is another thing that I would say is one of the largest state interventions in the economy that goes unacknowledged. The idea that you can own an idea, and that you can be the only person that is allowed to use that idea. Like, imagine if we did that in other areas of life, like recipes. There's only like one person that's allowed to know the recipe for kung pao
It stops
chicken in China.
competition, doesn't it?
Invented it. Like we say that all these other recipes are proprietary property, which is a really weird idea, because ideas are not rivalrous. Two people can own and use an idea at the same time without there being a conflict. Whereas physical things, you need to have property rights, because if someone owns a car, another person can't own the same car at the time. They can't use it 24 hours a day on either side. So I mentioned that because there's also this huge like state intervention in the realm of patents for medicines, which pushes up the price of medicines, which means that people can't cheaply make life-saving treatments and copy successful ideas from other companies. I mean, there's those. There's also like medical licensing, the amount it costs to take a doctor, to employ a doctor, even though the vast majority of treatments like could probably be done by someone who hasn't had like 10 years and £500,000 of like education to do. You still say that it has to be a doctor that makes the decision, describes the medicine. And that all these things coupled together add huge costs to the American healthcare system, which mean that it's like really expensive per capita, much more expensive than the UK. So I would say that like the systems we have across the world are not free market. we can kind of go into what a free market healthcare system would look like, but I would say that's the correct way to interpret why there are all these problems, rather than saying like, hey, like it's the private system that's failed.
Yeah, and it's interesting with the US because they always cite it as the free market guys of the world in terms of all aspects of society, but then no one ever questions all of the regulations that they've implemented in every single part of the society, such as, like you say, such as the healthcare, finance, like economic system is ridiculous. So they're seen as the free market guys who have really tried, but they clearly haven't. It's clearly been manipulated to look like that on the face of it, and kind of not be that in the back end, basically. But that's just the facade for the normal person to see that they're in a free country. And I think the US is definitely one of those places, if not the main place for that. But no, it's definitely interesting. I have one question before we sort of wrap this up. So if someone has owns a private land within a country, how does that work to become autonomous? Because that surely may be a challenge. Or how autonomous does it get? Are you kind of working within the frameworks of that nation, I'm guessing, to have this autonomous zone? So how would that kind of work?
Yeah, so the reason why we're working on this like free cities model, which is not quite like having a mini country, it's like partnering with a government to have some territory and basically have most of the functions of a modern government, or the powers of modern government rather, but within another state, is simply because there is not really any unclaimed territory on Earth. There's some disputed land on Earth. You mentioned Liberland, and that's been set up on a disputed piece of land between Serbia and Croatia. But if you're wanting to settle on land, you basically need to negotiate with a government. And so the system that we, or the strategy that we pursue with governments, is to try and create a win-win situation. So if there's an area of land that's currently not used, where there are landowners that are willing to sell, and there aren't any inhabitants that are not consenting, then we make the case that this would be a good thing too, because we can come in, we can bring in investment, we can create good infrastructure, we can bring in talented people, jobs. Those jobs and money will then flow to the rest of the economy. Like, we basically make the case to governments that this will be a good thing. This would be a win-win situation, a bit like Hong Kong, Shenzhen. If you look at this special economic zones that were set up in China, I don't think it's a coincidence that by far the most successful of those was just across the border from Hong Kong, which had a relatively much more free market system than mainland China, because you get agglomeration benefits from being close to other centers of prosperity. And if people are interested in this topic, we're hosting a conference in October called Liberty in Our Lifetime in Prague. And there's going to be a speaker there called Andreas Baumgartner, and he's giving a talk which is entitled How to Make Governments Desire Free Cities. So if people want to find out more about that specific topic, that I'd invite them to come along, and there'll be much more interesting stuff going on as well. But there'll be quite a lot of specific things on how you practically convince governments that free cities are a good idea on their territory.
Nice one. No, it sounds interesting. Definitely sounds interesting. And I feel like there is ways, maybe in more areas that are kind of away from maybe like the real controlled areas. Maybe like you mentioned, Honduras, places with kind of a little bit less bureaucracy and a little bit less of a society that is kind of really moving towards communism, but a little bit more laid back, a little bit more cultural. I think you can kind of get in there in a way and actually kind of incentivize them a little bit more than, let's say, going to the US government as an example. So that's interesting. That sounds really cool as well. But yeah, for those interested in kind of supporting and participating in the initiative, how can they get involved?
Well, I mean, we've got a newsletter that goes out once a month. So if your listeners go to free-cities.org/subscribe, they can subscribe to that newsletter there. That's going out about once a month, and it's got like all kinds of opportunities related to free cities. So events that are taking place in them. If people want to find out about like what are the array of free cities that are available, and go into depth on any of these, then, as I mentioned, our conference in Prague is the best place to do it. We're going to have 14 different free cities projects give their presentations, and they'll be able to tell people how people can get involved. It might be by making a visit. You can buy an apartment in Prospera. They've got some like amazing, like very good value for money apartments that have just popped up there. And there are loads of like cool businesses being established in these free cities as well. So if you're someone that's, if a listener is an entrepreneur and they're thinking, okay, well, where might I go so that I can really focus on my business rather than focus on my accounting and my compliance and my KYC and all of these other things, then they might want to consider what the options are in free cities. So they can find out more on our website. They can come to our conference. We've got a directory, free-communities.org, which has got like individual information about the projects. So I'd encourage them to check out any of those resources.
Sounds good. We'll have all the links in the description as well for all of you. So I guess we'll wrap it up there, Peter. But I guess thank you very much for joining. It's been a great insight, and I definitely want to maybe have you back on the show one time to just discuss more about the free market and actually go into the economic side of things, because I know you're certainly more quite well versed in that area as well. So we'll definitely maybe come back and sort of organize another chat. So thanks for sharing the vision and insights on the Free Cities project. It's definitely been eye-opening. We wish you the best of luck in regards to like the moving forward with it and the vision that you guys have. So to learn more, guys, on this initiative, definitely visit everything that was mentioned here. I'll have all the links in the description. If you enjoyed the episode, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment, and also join our email list with our sort of email blog that we do every month. We have at least 2 or 3 articles written by our guests. So keep up to date with our project on renegadelifestyle.net. With all the content, and again, our email list, sign up there. So thanks for joining, everyone. Peace.